It started as most of our hangouts did: laughter, friendly banter, and a casual game meant to pass the time. The group of us had gathered in Alex's living room, the heart of countless late-night conversations and impromptu challenges. I wasn't the type to draw attention to myself, preferring to observe from the edges of the action, but that night, everything shifted. Across the room, he was at his most confident, smirking, teasing, effortlessly commanding the space. Ben, my polar opposite in almost every way, had always been the center of our group. Where I was quiet and thoughtful, he was bold and unfiltered. Our dynamic was one of playful jabs and unspoken understanding, though I never let myself think too deeply about what lay beneath it. "All right, loser does a dare," Ben announced, leaning back into the couch with a self-assured grin. His green eyes sparkled with mischief, daring anyone to challenge him. The game had taken a turn from trivia to something more unpredictable, the stakes rising with every round. I glanced at him, shaking my head with a small laugh. "And what's the grand dare this time?" Without missing a beat, one of our friends chimed in. "How about if Ben loses, he has to kiss Charlie?" The room erupted in laughter, and for a moment, I froze. It wasn't unusual for jokes like this to surface. It was the kind of humor that thrived in our group. But this time, the air felt different, heavier. I forced a chuckle, brushing it off. Ben, however, raised an eyebrow and smirked. "Fine. But if I win, Charlie has to." He paused, searching for the perfect comeback. "Admit he's secretly in love with me." The challenge was laid out, and suddenly all eyes were on me. I rolled my eyes, trying to play along. "Bold of you to assume I'd lose, but sure." "Deal." The game continued, tension building as the questions grew trickier. Despite Ben's usual swagger, his confidence faltered as the rounds wore on. I couldn't help but notice his growing frustration. He wasn't used to losing, especially not to me. Then it happened. The final question stumped him, and the room erupted in cheers as I claimed victory. Ben groaned, leaning forward with a defeated sigh. "All right, a deal's a deal," he muttered, glancing at me with an unreadable expression. The laughter quieted as he stood and crossed the room. For a moment, the playful atmosphere faded, replaced by an awkward tension that neither of us seemed prepared for. Then, in a swift motion, he leaned in and kissed me, a quick, soft press of his lips against mine. It was over in seconds, but it felt like everything had changed. Ben pulled back, his usual bravado slipping into something uncertain. The room erupted again, teasing and laughter resuming as though nothing had happened. But I caught the flicker of something in Ben's eyes before he turned away, something that made my heart race. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The kiss, brief as it was, had left an imprint I couldn't shake. The room had erupted in laughter after the moment passed, but in my mind, everything felt quieter, sharper. I replayed it endlessly, the faint warmth of his lips, the surprised softness in his gaze when he pulled back. I told myself it meant nothing, but my chest tightened every time the memory surfaced. Ben had been unusually quiet since that night, too. Normally, he thrived on attention, cracking jokes and drawing people into his orbit. Now, though, his jokes felt half-hearted, his laugh quieter, like he was distracted. I noticed the way he avoided looking at me directly, and when he did, his gaze lingered just a moment too long. The first time we were alone after the kiss was a week later. The others had left early, leaving just the two of us in Alex's kitchen. The silence between us was uncharacteristically heavy, stretching out as we busied ourselves with clearing up empty bottles and snack bowls. About the other night, Ben's voice broke the quiet, startling me. I glanced at him, trying to read his expression. He wasn't smirking, wasn't teasing, just watching me with something close to uncertainty. "What about it?" I asked, keeping my tone light, though my heart pounded in my chest. He hesitated, running a hand through his messy hair. "It was just a joke, right? I mean, we were messing around." "Right, I said quickly, too quickly. My voice betrayed me, cracking slightly on the single word. He caught it. I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, but he didn't push. Instead, he nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. Yeah, of course. But even as he said it, neither of us seemed convinced. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope. Ben's usual confidence was nowhere to be found, replaced by moments of quiet introspection I wasn't used to seeing in him. He'd glance at me across the room, his expression unreadable, then quickly look away when I caught him. For my part, I couldn't stop analyzing every interaction. Did his laugh sound different when we talked? Was he standing closer than usual? Or was it all in my head? It wasn't just the kiss, it was everything it implied. Our easy dynamic had shifted, and no matter how much we tried to pretend otherwise, neither of us could ignore it. The next time we were alone, Ben broke the silence again. This time, his voice was softer, more deliberate. "Charlie, I can't stop thinking about that night." The weight of his words hung between us, and my breath caught. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a joke anymore. Ben's words hung in the air, fragile and uncertain. "I can't stop thinking about that night." His tone was uncharacteristically soft, each syllable carrying an unspoken weight. I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them, as though admitting them aloud made them real. I wanted to respond, to say something, anything, but my throat tightened, and all I could manage was a small, almost imperceptible nod. Ben stepped closer, the usual bravado gone. For the first time, he looked vulnerable, his confidence replaced by something raw. "I thought it was just a stupid bet," he continued, his voice low. "But when it happened, I don't know, Charlie. It felt different. It felt real. I didn't know what to say." My mind raced, torn between the fear of what his words might mean and the quiet hope that maybe I wasn't the only one who felt this way. "It's not just me, is it?" he asked, his green eyes searching mine. "Tell me I'm not imagining this." His words cut through my hesitation, and I exhaled slowly, the tension in my chest finally releasing. "No," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just you." The relief that washed over his face was unmistakable, and for a moment the tension between us eased. But the weight of the moment wasn't lost on either of us. This wasn't just about a kiss or a fleeting attraction, it was about everything that came next. Ben leaned against the counter, his hands gripping the edge as he let out a nervous laugh. "This is so messed up," he said, shaking his head. "I mean, we're us. This wasn't supposed to happen." "I know," I replied, my voice steadier now. "But it did." The silence that followed wasn't awkward or strained. It was thoughtful, filled with unspoken questions and realizations. 4 years, our friendship had been built on playful teasing and shared moments of closeness we never thought to question. Now, those same moments took on a new meaning, one we couldn't ignore. "What do we do now?" Ben asked finally, his voice tinged with uncertainty. I hesitated, then met his gaze. "We figure it out," I said simply. "Together." Ben smiled, a small, genuine smile that made my heart ache in the best way. "Together," he echoed. It wasn't a resolution, not entirely. There were still so many questions left unanswered, so many fears lingering at the edges of our newfound understanding. But for the first time since that kiss, I felt something I hadn't expected: hope. Ben reached out, his hand brushing mine for the briefest moment, and the warmth of that touch stayed with me long after he pulled away. Whatever came next, we'd face it together. The days after our conversation were like walking through uncharted territory. Everything between us felt different now, not broken, but fragile, as if one wrong step could shatter the delicate balance we'd found. But for the first time, we weren't hiding. Ben and I agreed to take things slow, though we never said what slow really meant. The shift in our dynamic was subtle yet undeniable. In a group setting, our usual banter still flowed, but there was an underlying softness to it, an awareness that hadn't been there before. Alone, though, everything felt amplified. One evening, Ben showed up at my door unannounced, something he'd done countless times before. But this time, the weight of what we were stepping into hung between us. "Hey," he said, his voice unusually quiet as he stepped inside. "Hey," I replied, the single word thick with meaning. He didn't bother with small talk, and I didn't need him to. We ended up on the couch, sitting closer than we might have a month ago. For a while, we talked like we always had, about everything and nothing at all. But eventually, the conversation turned to the one thing we couldn't ignore. "It's weird, isn't it?" Ben said, staring at the ceiling. "How one moment can change everything." "Yeah," I agreed, glancing at him. "But maybe it's not about it changing everything. Maybe it's about us finally noticing what was already there." Ben turned to look at me, a faint smile playing on his lips. "You always overthink things," he teased gently, though there was no edge to his words. "And you don't think enough," I shot back, smiling despite myself. The room fell quiet again, but this time the silence wasn't heavy. It was comfortable, filled with the unspoken understanding we were learning to navigate. Ben shifted closer, and when his hand brushed against mine, neither of us pulled away. "Charlie," he said after a long pause, his voice soft but steady, "I'm not sure where this is going, but I know I don't want to mess it up. I don't want to lose this, us." "You won't," I promised, meaning every word. "We'll figure it out, one step at a time." His hand slid into mine then, a small, simple gesture that carried the weight of everything we weren't ready to say yet. The weeks that followed weren't without challenges. Navigating the transition from friends to something more wasn't easy, but it felt right. Sweet moments began to replace awkward silences, lingering looks, stolen glances, and quiet laughter shared in spaces we once took for granted. One night, as we walked through the park under a sky full of stars, Ben squeezed my hand and looked at me with a smile that made my chest ache. "For the record," he said, his voice low and sincere, "losing that bet was the best thing that ever happened to me." I smiled back, my heart full in a way I hadn't known was possible. "For the record," I replied, "I'm glad you lost."